In the heart of Russia, where the great Volga River cuts through endless plains, one city would become the symbol of human endurance and human suffering: Stalingrad. A name that once meant progress, industrial might, and Stalin's vision for a modern Soviet Union would soon be carved into history as the deadliest battlefield the world has ever known. Between August 1942 and February 1943, over 2 million men, women, and children would perish here, in streets turned to ashes, in factories turned to fortresses, and in frozen cellars echoing with whispers of starvation and fear. It was more than a battle, it was the breaking point of the Second World War. In the early months of 1942, Stalingrad was an industrial jewel of the Soviet Union, a sprawling city of 500,000 people, lining the west bank of the Volga River. The city bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin, and for that reason alone, it held immense symbolic weight. Factories like the Red October, Barrages, and Dzerzhinsky tractor plant churned out weapons and tanks for the Red Army. River barges carried grain, oil, and steel. The air smelled of industry and optimism, despite the war raging to the west. But the shadow of the Wehrmacht was creeping closer. In June 1942, after their failure to conquer Moscow the previous winter, Adolf Hitler issued a new order: Operation Blue. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, would strike south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. But first, it would seize the city that bore Stalin's name. The propaganda potential was irresistible. Taking Stalingrad would not only cut Soviet supply lines but also deliver a personal humiliation to Stalin himself. Hitler's generals were confident. The Red Army, they believed, was still broken after the disasters of 1941. Their armies had driven deep into Ukraine, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners. To them, Stalingrad was just another step on the road to victory. They were wrong. By mid-July 1942, the German Sixth Army had crossed the Don River. Panzers roared across the steppes under blistering sun. Soldiers joked about reaching the Volga within weeks. Behind them, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, striking bridges, railways, and convoys. Villages burned. Civilians fled eastward in endless lines of carts and wagons. But even as the German army advanced, its flanks were dangerously stretched. The drive toward the Caucasus divided the Wehrmacht's strength. Hitler's obsession with the city drew men and resources away from more strategic goals. In Moscow, Stalin was enraged by the rapid German advance. He refused to abandon Stalingrad. The city would be held at any cost. Orders went out. Not one step back. This was Order No. 227, issued on the 28th of July 1942. It decreed that any soldier who retreated without orders would be shot. Behind the front lines, NKVD troops were stationed with machine guns, ready to execute deserters on the spot. For the Soviet soldiers, there would be no retreat, no surrender, only survival or death on the banks of the Volga. The first bombing. The 23rd of August, 1942. The afternoon of August 23rd began with clear skies. Children were playing along the Volga embankments. Workers labored in the factories. Civilians had heard of the war, but still believed the front was far away. Then, at 4 p.m., the air raid sirens began to wail. Moments later, over 1,000 German bombers descended upon Stalingrad. The attack lasted more than 6 hours. Incendiary bombs turned entire districts into firestorms. Oil tanks exploded near the river, spreading black smoke and liquid fire that ran across the streets like rivers of death. An estimated 40,000 civilians were killed in a single night. Eyewitness Lyudmila Zaitseva, then a young girl, later recalled, "The sky was red. Everything was burning. The houses, the trees, the river. We could not breathe. The air itself was on fire." By dawn, Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a ruin. Yet even amid the devastation, Stalin ordered reinforcements to cross the Volga. Soldiers came by night, ferried through smoke and flame. Many drowned, or were bombed mid-river. Those who survived landed in a world of hell, shattered buildings, bodies in the streets, and the thunder of artillery echoing every minute. The meat grinder begins. In early September 1942, the German Sixth Army entered the city. Their tanks rolled down Lenin Avenue, expecting quick victory. But what awaited them was unlike anything they had ever faced. The Soviet commander in Stalingrad, General Vasily Chuikov, had just taken charge of the 62nd Army. His orders from Stalin were simple: hold the city or die in it. Chuikov turned the city's ruins into a defensive maze. Every building became a fortress, every basement a bunker, every floor a battleground. Soviet snipers hid among the rubble, men like Vasily Zaitsev, a hunter from the Urals, who would soon become a legend. In one 10-day period, Zaitsev was said to have killed over 200 Germans. He later wrote, "The Germans called us rats. They were right. We lived underground, moved through tunnels, and struck from the shadows." Urban warfare negated Germany's advantage in armor and mobility. The Luftwaffe bombings, meant to destroy the city, had in fact created a perfect defensive terrain for the Red Army. Soon, German soldiers found themselves fighting for every room, every staircase. The famous saying spread among them: "The Russians are not in the next street, they're in the next room." Life inside hell. By late September, the front line had dissolved into chaos. Whole districts changed hands multiple times a day. The air was thick with dust, cordite, and the stench of corpses. Food was almost gone. Water had to be fetched from the Volga under constant fire. Soldiers drank from shell holes or melted snow. The civilians who remained, tens of thousands, huddled in basements. Some helped carry ammunition. Others buried the dead. Many simply waited, caught between two armies. Stalingrad was no longer a city, it was a tomb. The German High Command's overconfidence. By October, General Paulus reported that the Soviets were finished. The German Sixth Army controlled 90% of the city. The Red Army was pinned against the Volga. Hitler ordered, "No mercy. Take Stalingrad completely." He believed victory was within days. But Soviet reinforcements were already crossing the river. Each night, under cover of darkness, barges brought men and supplies from the East Bank. Many never made it. The Volga was filled with wrecks and bodies, but still the reinforcements came. Meanwhile, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most brilliant strategist, was planning something massive beyond the city's ruins, a counteroffensive that would change the course of the entire war. The turning point in the shadows. While Paulus's men bled inside Stalingrad, Soviet armies were gathering to the north and south. Entire divisions, including Siberian troops hardened by winter, were massing silently across the steppes. Their flanks were guarded by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, brave but poorly equipped, with little anti-tank support. Zhukov's plan, codenamed Operation Uranus, aimed not at the German spearhead inside the city, but at its vulnerable sides. If the Red Army could punch through the Axis flanks, it could surround Paulus's entire army inside Stalingrad. But the German High Command dismissed the possibility. Hitler refused to allow a withdrawal or even a tactical retreat. As snow began to fall in November, the stage was set for one of history's greatest reversals of fortune. The Germans believed Stalingrad was theirs. But what came next would trap them in a frozen nightmare from which few would return. It was dawn on November 19th, 1942. The ground outside Stalingrad was hard with frost, and a blinding wind swept across the steppe. German soldiers crouched in their trenches, shivering, unaware that within hours, their entire army would be encircled. At 7:30 a.m., the stillness was shattered. From the north, near Serafimovich, more than 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire in a thunderous, coordinated barrage. The roar was deafening, a rolling ocean of explosions stretching for miles. Soviet officer Nikolai Krylov later wrote, "The horizon turned red, the earth trembled. For the first time in weeks, I saw fear on the faces of the Germans." This was Operation Uranus, Marshal Zhukov's masterstroke. Its goal, to encircle and destroy the German Sixth Army by striking at the weak Axis flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Within hours, Soviet tanks of the 5th Tank Army burst through Romanian defenses. The poorly armed Romanian troops, equipped with obsolete anti-tank guns, were crushed under the assault of hundreds of T-34 seconds. In the south, near Kalach, another Soviet front attacked the Romanian 4th Army. The line collapsed completely. For the first time, the invincible image of the Wehrmacht cracked. The encirclement. By November 23, just 4 days later, the jaws of the Soviet trap slammed shut near the town of Kalach, on Don. 2 Soviet spearheads, one from the north, one from the south, linked up in a dramatic moment of history. Nearly 300,000 Axis troops, Germans, Romanians, Croats, and others, were trapped inside a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles long. Stalingrad, once the symbol of German triumph, had become their prison. In that instant, the hunters became the hunted. Inside the cauldron, General Friedrich Paulus faced an impossible choice: break out or hold his position. His staff urged him to fight westward while there was still time. But Hitler's order was absolute. From his headquarters in East Prussia, Hitler radioed Paulus. The 6th Army will stand fast. It will be supplied by air. Stalingrad must be held. Paulus obeyed. The failure of the airlift. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, promised to deliver enough food, ammunition, and fuel to sustain the encircled troops about 500 tons a day. But in reality, they could deliver less than 90 tons on average. The airfields were bombed daily. Pilots froze to death on runways. Fuel shortages grounded many planes. By December, starvation had set in. German rations fell to a few hundred grams of bread a day. Soldiers slaughtered horses for meat, then dogs, then anything they could find. Private Hans Reiser, a German infantryman, later recalled. We ate soup made from wallpaper paste. Men died standing. We had no strength even to bury them. Outside the encirclement, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein was appointed to rescue the trapped army. He launched Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through Soviet lines from the southwest. For a moment, hope flickered. German tanks advanced within 30 miles of Stalingrad. Paulus's men listened to the distant rumble of engines and believed salvation was near. But Paulus never attempted a breakout. Hitler had forbidden it, and when the Red Army counterattacked Manstein's relief force, the chance was lost forever. The frozen hell. By late December, temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite blackened fingers and faces. Wounded soldiers froze where they lay. Inside the ruins, the men of the 6th Army clung to life in cellars and bunkers. They burned wooden beams, ammunition boxes, even furniture for warmth. The city had become a place where death was ordinary and mercy impossible. Soviet loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals across the lines. They promised food, warmth, and survival. Few Germans dared to believe them. Those who tried to surrender were often shot by their own officers or cut down by crossfire. In one intercepted diary, a German lieutenant wrote, "Every night, more men vanish. We hear screams from the dark. Some shoot themselves. The rest just sit and wait. We are no longer soldiers, only ghosts." Civilians and Soviet suffering. While the Germans starved inside the pocket, Soviet soldiers and civilians suffered almost equally. The Red Army had fought for months in the ruins, often without proper winter clothing. Many froze to death in their trenches. Civilians trapped under the rubble continued to die long after the front had moved westward. Some were children who had survived since the summer bombings. They scavenged for bread in bombed-out kitchens, hiding from both armies. In Stalingrad, there were no civilians, only survivors. Soviet nurse Yevgenia Gigolenko described finding children near the riverbank. Their faces were gray, eyes hollow. They didn't cry anymore. They just stared. One boy whispered, "Is it over yet?" I couldn't answer. Hitler's obsession. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters, Hitler refused to accept reality. He promoted Friedrich Paulus to Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German army, on January 30th, 1943. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The message was clear. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the last man or take his own life. But Paulus did neither. By then, his army was starving, dying in droves. Hospitals overflowed with gangrene, and disease. Ammunition was gone. Entire battalions had vanished. When the Soviets launched their final assault on January 26, German resistance collapsed. On January 31, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket to the Red Army. 2 days later, the northern remnants followed. The end of the Sixth Army. Out of nearly 300,000 Axis troops encircled, only about 91,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The rest died in Soviet captivity, of cold, hunger, or disease. Stalingrad was a victory bought at unimaginable cost. The Soviets lost over 1.1 million soldiers and civilians in the battle, more than the combined casualties of Britain and America throughout the entire war up to that point. The city was nothing but ruins. Not a single building stood unscathed. And yet, Stalin ordered that Stalingrad be rebuilt as a monument to resistance. Aftermath. The turning of the tide. The surrender at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the first time, the Red Army had destroyed an entire German army in the field. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was broken. The Soviets had proven they could not only survive, they could win. Across Europe, the news spread like wildfire. In Berlin, silence filled the streets. In Moscow, church bells rang for the first time since the German invasion began. And for the men who had endured the nightmare, nothing would ever be the same. Soviet veteran Ivan Lapshin said decades later, "Stalingrad was not a victory, it was a grave. But it was also where we learned we could stand against hell itself." Epilogue. The legacy of Stalingrad. Today, the city bears a new name, Volgograd. But to the world, and to history, it will forever remain Stalingrad. The river still flows beside the hills where so many fell. Memorials rise over the fields where factories once stood. And on Mamiev Kurgan, the great statue the motherland calls towers above the city, a silent sentinel for the millions who perished. The Battle of Stalingrad was not only the bloodiest battle in human history, it was the moment the tide of the Second World War turned. In its ruins, the future of Europe was forged in fire, ice, and unthinkable sacrifice.